With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
So on this episode of Into the Fray, I welcome Aaron Deese back on with me. He is the author of 2 books all about Dogman. The first one is the Texas Dogman Triangle, and the second one, recently released, Hunting Grounds, Dogmen of the Lakes. And then, of course, as most of you know, Aaron and I co-host 2 documentaries so far. Only 2. We're going to work on that you can watch right now on most any streaming platform. Our first is the Dogman Triangle, Werewolves in the Lone Star State. And for our latest, we headed to Kentucky and the infamous, well, at least to our, nerds like us that are in the know, it's infamous Land Between the Lakes for Dogman Territory, Werewolves in the Land Between the Lakes. Aaron, welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be back. Very excited.
We're all here about the wolf, my friend. That's what we're going to be chatting about.
And we can finally talk about all this stuff. I'm very, very stoked for that.
Yes. There's been questions. And, you guys made it out alive. And yes, we did. So far, we're slightly unscathed. Second trip in. Who knows if we happen to walk back in there. One of the questions that was postulated by my patrons, we can open with this one, was, would you or I ever go in there? And I mean, you can probably gather from most documentaries that there's more than a couple of people out there, because you got to have camera people and there's a crew as such.
Yeah.
Would we ever go in there and just old school camp, nothing but a campfire, a couple of tents, and just chill out there? Would we have felt comfortable to do that? I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I'm going to say yes. The fact is that a lot of people camp and hunt in the Land Between the Lakes every year and don't see anything strange, or at the very least don't see werewolves. And maybe I'm ruining the whole conversation by starting it out with such a mundane answer, but I would. However, on the flip side of that, based on everything I've learned about the Land Between the Lakes and both the paranormal activity and just the shady human activity that goes on there, I would take more precautions to ensure my own safety than I normally would on a normal camping trip. Like, I would do a lot more research into the campground first. I would make sure I had some kind of a means of communicating with people outside the park, because as you and I experienced, cell reception there is pretty much non-existent. So I would, but I would be a lot more cautious. Yeah. And I would hedge my bets against preternatural horrors from beyond the veil of reality, because, as we've learned, there may be something to that. So yeah, but I would do it.
I have pretty much the same answer. It's not a hard no for me. Probably mostly because, as people know listening to the show, I'm probably a little jaded at this point to where, it's not like I've been so lucky in that I go to these very active and infamous, to use the word again, infamous locations, and I don't have a whole lot happen. Normally I have in the past, but I would be exactly the same. Just let people know where you're going, stuff that you should really do anyway if you're going out in the bush. But when you look at encounters like Martin, Daryl and things like that, and you start going, well, holy monkey. I mean, there's some really weird stuff that goes on out here, and maybe it's just me being, again, just a little jaded. I would do the same thing. I would go out and camp and chill, and maybe not want exactly those types of things to happen, but maybe a little something would be cool.
Yeah. And that's kind of the mindset I was in when we went out there. Like, at this point in my career, I hope that I never have a dogman sighting, because no one's going to believe me. But I did think it would be cool to, like, hear some weird noises, or, see some bushes rustling, or something like that. And nothing happened. So yeah, I'd be down for a second foray, a little more primitive, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting what you just said. And I wonder if this came up the first time we talked. I don't recall, but hey, if I don't recall, maybe most of the listeners don't recall either. So it's like a new question. You said that if you had a sighting, then no one would believe you. Does that mean that you maybe wouldn't share it, but with close friends or something, would you shout that publicly?
See, that's a really good question, and I've gone back and forth on this because I do believe that there's legitimacy to this phenomenon, and I do think that people documenting and sharing information is the only way we're going to get to any greater understanding of it. I don't want to say answers or a conclusion because we don't find those in the paranormal world. We just don't, not very often. But on the flip side, I've written two books on this topic and have been talking about it at length for a couple of years at one capacity or another. So the initial response from anybody, even people that might consider me to be credible, is going to be, well, of course you saw one. So in a way, I wonder if in this hypothetical scenario, if I were to see one of these things, if admitting to that would maybe pollute the discussion a little bit, because then a component of it is no longer what's the legitimacy of this phenomenon? What can we look at statistically to kind of paint a picture of it? It's also, is this guy credible? He says he saw, and I don't want to be in that category. So I hope I don't see one, but I think I would probably start by sharing it with like just not publicly. I would talk to people like you and several of our mutual colleagues before I shared anything publicly and probably get input from those people on whether or not it would be wise, to come forward with something like that. I haven't thought that much about that. That's a really good question.
It makes sense. No, it's a good answer. It does make sense. And I would hazard to say that even though I've been, Bigfoot's my favorite thing. And I would hazard to say that people probably have wondered that, like, oh, would Shannon share her Bigfoot sighting? And I would like to think that I would, but especially if it was this, not over the top, because it's not that I think that scary or in your face encounters are over the top. They're just that dramatic. They can be. We've heard those tales, and what if one happened like
Mhm.
that? And if you're talking about Dogman especially, they're all like that. Like, not all of them, but you know what I mean? They're more in this
Yeah.
category of just they come in close, they're super pissed off most of the time it seems, and they're very just like they got their chest puffed out and they're like, "What? This is my house. You're here and you're gonna have a really bad day." And
Mhm.
to be able to share that start to finish, and I again going back to Martin, I bless that guy for being willing to come forward and share every single aspect of his encounters.
Absolutely. And the thing with people like Martin, I talk about this a little bit in the book, but they are risking a lot by I think this is in our film as well. They're risking a lot by coming forward and making these statements. And yeah, it's easy to glance at anybody who does this stuff and go, well, they want to sell books. But as you and I both know, the selling of paranormal books doth not one a private island gain. It's not, you're not making millions of dollars to where it's worth throwing away your reputation, your credibility, having people in your life that you've known forever potentially go, oh, is this person nuts? You know what I mean? It's not worth that. So when you look at somebody like Martin and like Daryl, in the same category, who are taking a big risk by coming forward, to me, that says a lot. It says a whole heck of a lot.
So let's talk a little bit of the basics about the LBL and some of the history of that area, because as was postulated in the film, it might tie into some of the activity there.
Yeah. So the land between the lakes is unique not just because it's, apparently a paranormal hotbed and because it has this high association with dogman activity. It's also very strange because it wasn't always a peninsula. Today, it's the largest inland peninsula in the United States. But back in the 60s, instead of being two lakes, it was two rivers. And the government came in and said, hey, we're going to turn this into a national recreation area, going to bring in a ton of tourist dollars, going to really revitalize the area, be a huge economic boom, going to be a great thing. The problem was that a whole bunch of people lived there. And accounts seem to vary on how many, just based on the people that we talked to and what I found in my own research. But the largest estimate I saw was as many as 2,000 families. So multiply that by a few kids and relatives, stuff like that. You're talking about several thousand people. And I think the lowest estimate was like 600 to 900 families. So either way, a few thousand people. And these people were told you have X number of days or weeks to get off your property. You're going to be paid X number of dollars, which was not comparable to the value of the land, from what I understand. And many people refused to leave. Those people in some cases were arrested. There are stories of people showing up to town hall meetings, to talk about the government coming in. And then when they got home from those meetings, their homes had been leveled. A lot of bad stuff associated with this. So, in the process of uprooting all these people and moving them, they also dammed these two rivers to make, the Kentucky Lake and Lake Barkley. And in the process of doing that, there was massive flooding. The entire landscape was reshaped. And now you have towns and homes, and in some cases, whole cemeteries that are underwater. So massive displacement, massive reshaping of the land. And for several decades before that, starting in the 1800s, there was a massive iron and limestone mining operation in place there. So even before this, the land had been, torn up and ripped apart and reshaped by, human beings. So that's all the way up through the 60s. It goes from being an iron and farming rural community to place where people are just kind of living, hanging out, doing their business, to the government coming in and making it this federal recreation area. And now it's just kind of sitting there. There's not a lot of funding for it. There's very, very low personnel keeping an eye on things. There's a lot of crime that goes on there. And which the reason you and I are probably having this conversation, there's a very high concentration of paranormal activity. So that was a very long answer. I hope that was
That was
sufficient.
excelente. All right. So, because of the fact that, I mean, you are essentially one of the go tos now for Dogman, right? I mean, let's face it. That is now your moniker. It's a pretty freaking cool moniker. So, have you seen a difference, or are they exactly the same between the Dogmen of the LBL and the Dogmen that you have there in Texas, as far as physical attributes, level of aggressiveness, and also which area, which state, I should just generalize that, which state, according to the Dogman lore, then also has more paranormal activity tied to it?
Ooh, that's fun. Okay. So with the land between the lakes, I was admittedly looking at a smaller cross section of reports. I think with the Texas Dogman Triangle, it came down to something like 27 total reports from historical newspaper articles and witnesses. And in Texas, I see kind of a 50-50 split between the really unnatural, supernatural, spooky encounters that leave people feeling very unsettled and very unhappy afterward, and the more mundane, like, hey, it was kind of like a Bigfoot sighting, but it looked like a wolf. In the land between the lakes, I think the total number of encounters and reports, I don't have that in front of me. I don't know. I actually haven't sat down to figure that out. It is a few less than the Dogman Triangle. And because I'm not from Tennessee and Kentucky, and I didn't have all that area knowledge, all that population knowledge already, I was reliant a lot on the people that we spoke to. So I kind of limited my data pool to people that I was actually able to interview and get their accounts firsthand. Because the fact is, if you go digging into werewolf encounters or dogman encounters in the land between the lakes, you're going to find a lot of stuff online that is unsubstantiated. Mostly, you're going to find stuff about the LBL massacre, which I'm sure we'll get to. But there's not a lot that you can kind of follow a trail on and identify a witness. It's a lot of stuff on Reddit. It's a lot of stuff on Facebook's a little better because you generally kind of know who those people are. But it's just a lot of stuff that can't be verified versus the witnesses that we talked to and the researchers we talked to when we were there who have had these firsthand experiences. Then we're operating from a baseline of knowing who these people are. In that case, looking at the data pool, if I can use that term, from the land between the lakes, it seems like we're looking at a more, probably 70 to 80% being more unnatural, leaving people unsettled, taking place near graveyards, taking place when the moon is full. Stuff like that seems to come up a lot more often in the land between the lakes. So does that answer the question? Sorry, I went on another tangent there.
No, absolutely no. And I love tangents. And it's funny you bring up the moon, because one of my other patrons, Denise, mentioned, did you find any correlation or a pattern with moon phases and some of these sightings? And you did.
Yes, there is some, and I can't say that it's in every case because not every case did we have exact dates to where, we could necessarily drill down on that. But at least in the case of Gabby Henderson, who I love the way she tells her story. Another side tangent here, and this is mentioned in the book, but she tells her story so factually and so she's just telling you what happened. She's not trying to sell you a narrative. She's not trying to, oh, I had this outrageous experience. It's almost like she's giving a police report. And I think all of the people we talked to are credible and gave great accounts. But her story really strikes me just because of how frank and blunt it is. But anyway, yeah, Gabby's encounter took place when the moon was in about full phase. She mentioned that during our interview, and I went back and did some digging, and three different websites confirmed that yeah, the moon was pretty much at full when this encounter took place. So there is some correlation there. Yeah.
So the moon phases might segue really well into something that I know that we touched on in our first conversation, but we should likely touch on again if people are not familiar with the Dogman subject, and that is even in the titles of not only we've got the books, we've got the docs, and each one mentions the word werewolf. And are we talking about a man that turns into a wolf at the full moon? What are we talking about here? But then you mentioned the Dogman, which is postulated to be, to some, born and bred and grows up a bigger doggy man. What in the world are we doing using these two words? Are they interchangeable?
Yeah. So this answer will take up the rest of our conversation. No, not really. But yeah, this is kind of the ultimate question for a lot of researchers, right? Is are we talking about two different things? Do these things overlap? Is one fictitious and is one based in science? At least for me, like that's kind of my white whale right now. And my thinking on this has changed a lot because when I started researching Dogman, I was very much of the opinion that this is a cryptozoological phenomenon. This is a result of crossbreeding between different canines, adaptive behaviors, things we can find precedent for in the wild, specifically talking about Texas, because we have strange canine hybrids. We have wolves kind of creeping back into the population in places where they weren't supposed to be before. We can cite examples of dogs walking on two legs as a learned or adapted behavior. But the more time I spend with it and the more people I talk to, the more it seems that there is something else going on here. There's something else beneath the surface. And spending too much time on that takes you down the line of speculation as to like what is the supernatural, what are ghosts and demons, are aliens in play here, are alternate dimensions in play here. But at the end of the day, you can't write off the entire phenomenon as one or the other. You simply can't. At least right now with the data that we have, it's not possible to do that. As far as the terms werewolf and dogman, I use them interchangeably. One, because the root terms, that make up those words are pretty much the same thing. Two, there are only so many ways to describe something. And when you're writing a book about something, you can only say dogman so many times. So not, it's a joke. But three, and this is the real reason that I think they're used interchangeably, is that is what the witnesses use to describe what they have seen. I am very much of the opinion that, there's no room for gatekeeping or, saying, no, this is that, that is this in the realm of cryptozoology or the paranormal, because everything we do is speculative. And more to the point, we are 100% reliant on eyewitness testimony to continue doing what we do. Videos and pictures only get us so far, and now we have AI generated imagery. So make of that what you will. But for us to say to a witness, no, you didn't see a werewolf, it's actually called Dogman, that doesn't work for me. It starts with the eyewitness testimony. It starts with their description of what they have seen. And if the witness says, I saw what resembled to me a werewolf, that's the terminology that I'm going to use. And it's not my place to tell any other researchers they're wrong in their approach. And I don't mean it that way, but I do feel very strongly about that because people will get in the weeds about separating these terms. And I feel there's an element of kind of discounting the eyewitness's account when we do that. So, yeah.
On the Howard Stern show, he has his whack pack, and there is one of the whack packers named High Register Sean, and he's into cryptids and Bigfoot. He talks a lot about Bigfoot, but he also talks about Dogman. And then he started to describe, he says that Dogman I forget what state he's in, somewhere more rural than I am, obviously, and in his backyard, essentially, right in the woods. Within the tree line, he's finding signs of Dogman. And Howard goes, well, what is a Dogman? Describe this to me. And High Register says, it's a dog's head on a man's body. And, and to me, I'm being the huge, obvious nerd that I am, screaming at my Sirius XM app when I'm hearing this is ridiculous, because to me it's ridiculous that I even know what a Dogman should look like. When you step back from it, to most people they would go, how funny you would actually correct this person. But I was screaming and I'm like, no, now you're just making it sound ridiculous. It's not a man's body. Like literally he was taking just a man's body, cutting off the head and putting a dog's head on it, essentially is how he was
Yeah.
describing it. Maybe that's not what
It's
he
not
meant.
that.
But, and then of course they go into, well, is it a super soldier created by the government then? And I'm just wanting to reach through and correct him on what all of them thought was this completely ridiculous subject. But when you really look at what has gone on in the history books, even way back from what we're talking about, people are seeing something. And whether or not they can grow up in dens and wag their little tails on their little doggy butts, I don't know. But when you have, I keep referencing Martin's encounters, but you have little details like metallic sounds in tandem with a Dogman encounter, and you're going, well, what in the hell would that be then? That throws wrenches into mommy, daddy in the den, making puppies, and then they grow up to be bigger doggy men to get pissed off at us in the woods. Things like that just really, really throw wrenches in. And not to mention aspects of bioillumination, essentially, being luminescent and mists and all of these other things that come into play with this. And you're going, well, we certainly can't put our finger on anything right now, what these are.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's interesting because we know so much more than we did even 2 years ago, when you and I first kind of started this tandem Dogman journey together. Like, we know so much more than we did, at least in terms of eyewitness testimony and places where this is concentrated. And I'm glad you mentioned the metallic sounds because that does come up in the documentary. But it's something that admittedly I didn't dig into as much for the book as I wanted to. One, because it came up very late in the research process, like deadline was set by then. And two, it's taking me on lines of speculation that needed more than just being rammed into one chapter. So there's so many layers to this that we're still learning about and that we're still getting reports on, that people have said that Bigfoot research is in its infancy. I think a member of the Olympic Project said that on Road to Discovery recently. But if that's the case, then Dogman research, like mom and dad just met, they're on their second date. Like, we're very early on in this process of looking into this stuff and documenting these reports. We don't have any kind of a database where we can cross-reference different stories and different encounters in different areas. There are people like the NADP who are working towards that, but we don't have a huge comprehensive database that's been compiled yet. So we're so early on. It's so difficult to make guesses.
Have you come across then other encounters relating to Dogman where there was some kind of maybe they didn't even say metallic sound. Maybe they had a hard time describing what it was, but where there was just this weird sound in the woods that didn't belong in tandem with a Dogman encounter?
Yeah, for sure. What comes up the most are these reports of animal slash human like howls that don't seem to fit into any category. Now, the problem with that, admittedly, is that animals can make some very, very strange noises. Like, things that you would not think any living being is capable of making. Those sounds can be produced in some cases by coyotes and rabbits and cats. My wife is a veterinary technician, and she knows I'm interested in this stuff, so she'll frequently send me audio files and be like, guess what this is, and her clinic doesn't work with exotic animals, so I know it's got to be either a cat or a dog. But I mean, any sound you can imagine, she sent it to me. Animals can do crazy things. But the flip side of that is when these reports from people saying, I heard this unearthly sound that I don't think could be made by any normal animal, when those reports come from people like farmers, ranchers, hunters, veterinary technicians, people who are very familiar with the sounds that animals make in that environment, and they're still going, what the heck is this? And then a few minutes later, a few minutes before, they see what looks like a wolf walking on two legs. That kind of cinches it.
Yeah, I think anytime you have any of these precursors, especially go back to that camping trip that we talked about being willing to go on, you start hearing metallic sounds and then you see an orb in the woods. It's probably just time to leave the tents behind and leave. Make like
Oh
a
yeah,
tree and
best
leave.
case.
Yeah.
Yeah, best case scenario, it's some kind of supernatural monster. Worst case scenario, there's a guy running around out there with a sword. I mean, no,
Yeah.
I'm good.
That would also suck. pretty damn bad. I'll never forget Micah's story of that freaking dude in the overalls just watching he and his friend walk through the woods. I'm like, nope,
Yep,
no.
yep.
God, the woods, I love it. Okay, speaking of making like a tree and piecing out of a place, we have to, because people go, what the hell? Are you talking about the LBL and not the M word? So let's talk about the massacre.
Yes,
Honestly, prior to
let's.
talking to Jesse and Joe, we had a nice long chat with them in the dock, and you guys will
Mhm.
get to see a good hefty portion of that. And we also went out with them in person, of course. And the massacre got a little bit more solidified for me in certain aspects after speaking to Jesse and Joe. Was your mind changed in any way, shape, or form prior to talking to anyone that we talked to, or prior to going to the places that we went?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I started like a lot of people do with this story, and I answer that way because it's something I've gone round and round about, and I'm still going round about. But I started with this story where a lot of people do. It's an invention. It's an urban legend. All of the pieces are there to concoct a story like this and have no one be able to debunk it. You know what I mean? And it slaps so hard of internet creepypasta so hard. Like it's the kind of thing that all the time comes up in message boards. Not message boards aren't really a thing anymore, I guess, but on TikTok and Instagram and Reddit. So I guess message boards are still a thing that you just write off, like the Russian sleep experiment. You hear that story and it sounds perfect, but you know it's an invention. That was the category I placed this in. But then you do a little more digging, and it's factual. It's provable that this story predates the internet. People have been talking about this story in the Land Between the Lakes since the earliest point we could identify was 1982. The earliest point that I mentioned in the book is 1987, and that's only because 1982 came from third hand, and I wanted to trace that story as early as I could from a firsthand witness. But as early as 1982, which is when this event is supposed to have taken, people have been talking about this incident involving a family of four who were on an RV trip who were killed by some kind of upright walking wolf, or maybe more than one of them. So we know this story has roots outside of the internet, and that to me narrows down, at least to some extent, narrows down the avenues of invention. Like once a story is out there publicly, if we can't trace an origin point for it, it can come from literally anywhere. It can come from someone who heard about the Land Between the Lakes and heard about Dogman and thought, well, this sounds like fun. But at least we know that if this is a concoction or an invention, it originates in the area where it's set to have taken place. So going from there, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. Then it starts to seem a little bit more feasible because there's all this surrounding conjecture and all these additional reports of people being attacked by these things coming from people like Mike Smith and Martin Groves and Jesse and Joe. So it's not just one story isolated to this one area. And then you find out people in the Land Between the Lakes may have been seeing these upright walking wolf forms since the 1700s. There's credible conjecture, again, coming from Mr. Martin Groves, that members of the Transylvania Fur and Land Company were seeing these things. So it's difficult to say, oh, yeah, this just came from the internet because we know that it did not. So in my mind, I think something happened. I think at the very least, someone was attacked by some kind of animal and it maybe spread from there. Whether or not it was a dog man or a coyote, that's where we get in the weeds. That's where it becomes really hard.
Yeah, by the way, we went to, I mean, as close as we can figure, the site. So you guys can see that on the dock. It's definitely a creepy area. It does remind me a lot of Ohio,
Mhm.
just being back there, the way that the place is set up. And the woods definitely have a creepy vibe. Was I scared to be in there? No, I was not. But of course, there was many of us present.
In the safest way you can, short of wearing like a bear attack suit or
Yeah,
something. That's a thing, right? Suits for being attacked by
absolutely.
bears. Yeah, because we had Alex Pedikov with us. We had, Seth, Courtney, Heather. I think Eli was there that night,
Yeah.
and Jesse and Joe. You can't get much more protected than having that many lights and people who know how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. So, yeah, if it was, I expect the vibe would have been very different if it had been a smaller group or if we had gone on a proper camping. I will say that if I was going to go camping there, I probably would not go to that area. am willing to say that. One, because of all the conjecture around it, but then two, it is very, very isolated. It isn't a very away from things kind of place. So
The only time I was uncomfortable is we went into one of the concrete bunkers, and we had been in there for quite a while. We were chatting and doing a little filming in there. And strange, by the way, because some of the bunkers have these hollow floors, and we were just dying to get under there. But you guys can see that in the doc. But at some point, I think it was Seth, maybe, he's like, "Hey, Shannon, look at that." And there was a massive, disgusting spider up in the corner. And I'm
yeah,
such a sissy about stuff like that. That was the only time that I was uncomfortable there. So I will be honest about that.
I don't do spiders. I will say this with all seriousness, I would rather have a scary dogman encounter than be in close proximity with a spider. I don't mess with those guys. Yeah, that's when I was out. I think we cut after that
Yeah, because
and
then I
got out
just
of
was
there.
distracted. I kept looking over my shoulder. In fact, when we were, here's a little inside track for you folks. Our closing scene was
I was about to bring
on
this up.
where
Yeah.
you was on a porch at night, and one of us noticed that literally right above our head was just this not as big as the one in the bunker, but still big enough that neither one of us enjoyed it. And we both would we would talk, and then we'd look up and make sure little homie was still in the same place. I know that neither one of us liked that very much.
Yeah, well, we couldn't cut and reposition or get rid of the spider or something because we'd
Yeah,
already recorded part of that dialogue scene.
yeah,
We were
we had to be
we
in the
were
same
uh,
place.
yeah, so we couldn't just abruptly restage. So it was like, okay, let's just have this conversation. And I remember this vividly. One of the particularly large spiders was doing that horrible thing where they just slowly lower themselves down. So it was getting kind of closer to where we were,
Yeah.
and I was just like, man,
Don't
man,
don't be an eight-legged a-hole. We're trying to work here. Let's just, please.
yeah,
Yeah, I was very
leave me
distracted
alone
by
so I can
that.
leave you alone.
And I everyone knows my fear of spiders too. So see, now that they know that you have that, they'll start sending you stuff as well. So there you go.
That's great.
Yeah, they'll tag
That's
you and
wonderful.
stuff like they do me, and I'm like, thanks guys. So another thing to just really quickly tease, in case people don't know, and we keep mentioning Jesse and Joe, and they are of course of Hellbent Holler. Please go check them out
Hmm.
over on the U of the Tube. They and this has already been out in the ether. I'm nearly 99% sure, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the doc we show the thermal image that they captured when they were out
Hmm.
on one of their, investigations out there in that area. We went to now here's a clincher for me, because once you see the thermal image, it looks like an Anubis head, just straight up like triangle ears, and of course, from the picture, you can't tell how large it is. But when Joe goes over to that little embankment, essentially it was, and stands there, you can then see how big that thing actually is. Whatever the hell it is, it was large. So for me, I'm going, holy
Hmm.
crap, this is really cool.
Yes. Yes, and I walked through the trees with Joe. I walked down into that gully, and I stood in that spot, and I couldn't see over the top. Joe is a fair amount taller than me. He's 6 something, and I'm around 5'7". So whatever was on that embankment had some height to it. Even if it had crawled its way up a little bit and was, like, perched on the edge of the embankment or something like that, you're still talking about something with some significant size and height. And what's really compelling about that, there's a number of things that are compelling about it, but Jesse and Joe sent that image to people that work with thermal cameras, who are wildlife photographers, people who are experts on this stuff. And even they said, I can't tell you what this is. None of them came down and said, this is proof of the existence of werewolves. I'm calling the scientists. But when that many people who are that familiar with the equipment and the environment and the wildlife are going, I don't know what this is, that's something you have to stop and think about. Yeah.
So I'm thinking of the Skinwalker Ranch, the bulletproof wolf right now, right?
Hmm.
How many, or it doesn't even have to be someone actually shooting at it, but how many instances can you think of where somebody, it got hit by a car, or maybe they did try to take a shot at it, or they claim, nope, that was point blank, should be down. We've even heard that about Bigfoot.
Hmm.
Do we have that same situation out in the LBL at all?
We do. In Texas, I'll go back to Texas for a second, where we have a couple of encounters where that exact thing happens. I am sure that I put a round into this thing. and it kept moving. We have two encounters that kind of concern that same thing in the Land Between the Lakes. And one is the massacre story itself. According to the person who claims to be an eyewitness of that event, he did open fire on these creatures and they actually responded to it. One of them, according to his story, actually died on the scene. So that's an interesting contrast because usually when we hear about these things being shot, they seem to shrug it off.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have, once again, Mr. Martin Groves' encounter where he and his hunting partner opened fired on one of these things and it got away. It kind of leapt up the side of an embankment and before coming back to destroy their campsite. So we do have some of that same activity in the Land Between the Lakes. You could make the argument in Martin's case that it was dark. Maybe he didn't hit it. I don't know. Martin's a trained law enforcement officer. He's dealt with some really terrible things and he knows his way around the woods and he knows his way around a firearm. So a- at the close proximity he was describing, it's difficult for me to imagine him not hitting it, but that's just my personal opinion. So yeah, yes is the answer, but it's kind of one of those things where I think we need more data. Yeah.
Yeah, and you guys will see it in the doc, but when we are in this little ravine, I keep saying the word ravine, but maybe like you use the word gully, that might be a little bit more apt to describe some of these. It's not exactly big enough for a holler, I don't think, but we were standing there after dark, and Martin is he got a little emotional, right? And he's talking about, I think one of us asked him, well, why do you still do this? Do you want to still come out here? Because he does. He goes back out. He tries to essentially recreate a very traumatic event for him. And he got emotional.
Yeah.
And I was so just sucked in at that moment. I was starting to get I was right there with him. So because I suppose that just after talking to so many people, it definitely hits different when you're standing in front of somebody, of course, and we were very close to where some of this actually occurred for him. And he's saying, I know that my family doesn't like it, but I come out here and I just feel like I have to do this. I have to know. I have to. And you can just see how much it affected him. And that's why it's all fun. And and I laugh and we all laugh about, oh, wouldn't it be fun to go out and need some brown pants because you saw a dogman because they're a-holes or, whatever the situation was. But when you're standing there with someone like Martin and it has changed his entire life and his drive and his focus has definitely, not for his entire life, but he's got this drive that might put him right back in the same situation again. You can't tell me that didn't happen to that man.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. Like we were talking earlier about, the incentive to come forward on this stuff and I'm gonna maybe sell a bunch of books. Like this is not a guy who's doing TikTok live streams or posting on, all the dogman groups. I found this shuffle in the woods today. Could be a footprint. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about somebody who's on a deeply personal journey, who is kind enough to open up to us and include us in it, to some extent. But we're not talking about a guy who's chasing internet cloud or trying to get on TV. Not a lot of, or I mean, a lot of people know this, but I don't hear it come up nearly often enough. The first time Martin shared his story publicly was in the first American Werewolves film, and Heather Mosier found him through a very small, obscure discussion thread where someone had posted about, hey, I saw one of these things, and Martin had responded, this sounds pretty similar to something I experienced. And Heather was able to get in touch with him, and that's the reason you and I are able to have this conversation. So again, like witness credibility, witness motivation, that's a big thing. I don't begrudge anybody their book sales or their documentary appearances or anything like that. But, you can see when you look at some people who come into the public eye in any paranormal niche, there's a very noticeable and trackable incentive to gain followers, to gain clout, to gain credibility. That's not Martin. Martin is a guy who is sharing what he's experienced, and he's not here trying to convince you that it happened. He's just going to tell you, this is what I saw.
So in closing, for anybody that's new to Dogman, have you had to paint a picture for them? They go, what a dog, you have books on Dogman? What is a Dogman? What, do you have an answer for that?
Yeah. Yeah, I've gotten pretty good at this. Like your dentist, your doctor, they always ask you what you do, and I'll say like, yeah, I write books, and I work with a film company. We do stuff on like, weird things like aliens and I usually name the big three: aliens, Bigfoot, and ghosts. And most people like that register. So like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I've heard of books about Bigfoot. And if they ask anything more specific, then I'm like, yeah, actually werewolves. Like my thing is Dogman. But when it does come up and people are like, what is it that you write about again? I'll be like, just think werewolves, except they might actually exist. And people who are interested, that starts the conversation and sets the stage. People who are not interested, they let you know real fast. So at least through like body language. So that usually navigates most conversations on Dogman for me.
Yeah, we get really good at reading body language, right? I've gotten that too.
Oh yeah.
The looks and then
Yeah.
you can just see the body and the brain just shutting down to what you might have said beyond what you already have.
Yeah. I just equate it to like, if an accountant tries to tell me what they do for a living, I'm not interested in that. So that's how I look at it. Some people just aren't interested in what I do for a living. I respect it. It's cool. It's cool. I think that they're all blind and they need to open their eyes to the reality that werewolves are all around us. But that's just my opinion. Just my opinion.
Woof. That's all we got is woof. All right, so let everybody know where to find the book, Hunting Grounds, Dogmen of the Lakes, and where they can watch our latest Small Town Monsters documentary, Dogman Territory, Werewolves in the Land Between the Lakes.
Yes, yes, yes. The best place to get your hands on all of those things, and really any Small Town Monsters content, is smalltownmonsters.com/shop, because you're getting it straight from us. You can also get the book in Kindle or your physical copy on Amazon. No judgment if you use Amazon. I'm just saying, and you can also check out the film. It is at time of air on several VOD platforms. You should be able to catch it on Apple Video, Vudu, and Prime Video. But with the digital distribution, sometimes dates can fluctuate. So, but physical copies, shop.smalltownmonsters.com. Yes.
Well, thank you for coming on again, Aaron, and I look forward to not only our next chat, but our next adventure.
Yes. Thank you. I've been so excited for this. Thank you so much.